What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? Welcome to the Lost and Found Dating channel. Thank you for tuning in. If this is your first time checking out our channel, welcome you to our Lost and Found family. On this channel, we talk about three things, right? We talk about dating, we talk about life, and we talk about dating life, combining both elements. So, like I said, if this is your first time checking out the channel, we want to welcome you. Be sure to check us out on some of our other platforms. You can find us on Twitter. You can also find us on Instagram as well, where you can see some behind the scenes footage, get some previews and some clips of some of our videos. And without further ado, let's dive into this week's topic. All right, friends, so in this video, we're going to be talking about something called codependency. Now that maybe that's a term that you've heard of before, maybe it's a term that you haven't heard before. I first heard about this term about maybe, I would say 4 years ago, as I've mentioned a channel that I've been following for a while now that I've learned a lot from, Richard Grandin's channel. And it was a term that I first heard around about four or 5 years ago, and it totally opened my eyes to just unhealthy relationships and how they work. And one of the things that you learn when you start to understand codependency is often a hallmark, it's often a staple of a lot of unhealthy relationships, a lot of unhealthy relationship dynamics. So what is codependency? So according to the New Oxford Dictionary, which is the source that I'm going to use and I'm going to read from, codependency is an excessive emotional or psychological reliance on a partner, typically one who requires support on account of an illness or an addiction, right? So that is the more, I'll say, traditional view of codependency. Usually it's used in the context of maybe you have one partner or one family member who is sick or is ill and is very dependent on another partner, and it starts to develop an unhealthy relationship between those two individuals, right? That's your kind of classical view of codependency. But I actually found an article that I think has a more expansive, more diverse, kind of more versatile description of codependency that I really like and that I think is helpful for a lot of people who may be in these kinds of relationships. So I'm going to read what that definition is. So in that article, and I'll include the link in the description box, codependency is defined as a relationship in which two people become so invested in each other that they can't function independently. And it goes on to give a description. Typically, you have one person who is more passive and can't really make decisions for themselves, and a more dominant personality who gets some reward and some satisfaction from controlling the other person and making decisions about how they live and how they navigate their life, right? So often, as you can see from that description, what you have is one person who is a little bit more passive, maybe a little bit more lax with their boundaries, maybe a little bit more compromising, maybe a little bit less assertive. And then you have another individual who's a part of that relationship who is a little bit more demanding, who's a little bit more controlling, who's a little bit more assertive, and maybe more willing to encroach when it comes to that other individual's boundaries and guidelines for how they wish to navigate their life. So as you can imagine, let's say you and I are in a relationship, and let's say I am assuming that more kind of dominant, more controlling role, right? If I take it upon myself to determine for you what is right, what is wrong, right? What is good, what is bad, what is healthy versus what is unhealthy. As I get more and more comfortable with doing that, and as you become sort of less and less resistant towards my behavior, those things that we call boundaries, they start to just kind of erode, and your boundaries will start to cease to exist as I get more and more comfortable kind of being controlling and more comfortable telling you, what is right and what is wrong, and telling you how you should and shouldn't live your life. So if the abuser knows what's best for you, then they are just assuming that their behavior is right. Your ability to decipher for yourself what's right or wrong, you no longer start to need that, right? And it's just whatever they're telling you or instructing you to do, it's not even abuse, right? It's just the right way of doing things, right? Because they've assumed that role, and because they get to dictate, what's up and down, and what's right from wrong, and what's good versus bad. Whatever they're telling you or instructing you or demanding you to do, you just start to assume that that is the right way of doing things. So in this situation, in this scenario, even though what the person is doing or what the person is saying, even though you may feel inside that this goes against my boundaries, even though you may be feeling, something seems off, something seems wrong about what they're doing, you have to remember that in this kind of controlling, codependent environment, you don't get to determine what's a boundary break or not, right? You don't get to determine what's appropriate or what's inappropriate as far as that kind of behavior, right? You don't get to set the rules, right? They get to set the rules of this game that we call friendship or a relationship. If I make up a game, right? Let's say it's a board game, right? If I make up a game and I get to determine the game, I get to set the rules, but let's say not only do I get to set the rules, but I get to determine when the rules are enforced, right? I get to determine when it's okay to be a little bit flexible with the rules, when it's okay to adjust the rules, when it's okay to sort of take liberty in our own interpretation of the rules, right? If I get to determine all those things, you would never be able to win the game, right? How could you ever win when I have control over all these different pieces of the scenario, right? You would never be able to win. You would never be able to thrive in that situation, because the minute that you think, okay, I've figured out, I guess, what's appropriate or inappropriate, it changes from one scenario to the next based on, again, them being able to set the rules and adjust the rules based on what they think is okay, right? Based on what they think is a healthy way of navigating that relationship. So the odds are always going to be against you, right? So now that brings us to the question of, how do you remove yourself from that situation? How do you remove yourself? Or if it's not remove yourself, how do you work to adjust that codependent environment and maybe work to mend things, or maybe work to just remove yourself out of the situation? And for me, as far as my personal experience, one of the crucial pieces and one of the crucial mindsets that I had to develop was I had to be able to distinguish my own subjective experience and my own subjective reality from what this other person was experiencing, right? And from their own subjective reality. And that sounds very sort of philosophical and very mystical, but let me break down what I mean when I say that. In order to remove yourself from codependence, right, you have to work, you have to fight, you have to scratch and claw your way towards independence, right? So what does independence mean? That means you have to establish and assert yourself as an individual who has their own feelings, right? Their own wants, their own needs, their own desires, their own, again, subjective experience, their own reality that exists outside of your partner, right? Outside of that individual in the codependent relationship that you have. So now, what does that look like in a practical, kind of realistic sense, right? What does that look like if I apply that to just an everyday scenario or kind of situation, right? So let's say again, for the sake of this example, let's say you and I are partners, right? Let's say you and I are in a relationship, and let's say I, as a partner, I am physically abusive towards you. And I'm going to use that example because I feel like that's something that kind of is readily accessible in people's minds, and people can kind of wrap their head around, what that looks like, and understand that that's not okay. Emotional abuse or psychological abuse, sometimes if you haven't experienced it, or if you haven't kind of thought about it and taken time to understand and see what it looks like, sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around that. So let's just say I'm physically abusive, right? Because again, that's something that we have a sense of what it looks like, and we can understand that it's not okay to hit your partner when you're upset with them or they do something that you don't like, right? So let's say we're in a relationship, and whenever you do something that I don't like or that I don't approve of, I hit you for it. Let's say you decide that you'd like to spend some time with your coworkers after work, and I don't want you to do that. I want you to come straight home. I don't want you to have any social life. I don't want you to have any friends or people that you spend time with outside of me, right? So let's say after you spend time with your coworkers, you come home, and let's say, I hit you on the arm. Let's say I punch you or I smack you on the arm, right? Your arm feels pain, right? You're gonna feel a negative stimulation from that act that I just took. And I know that sounds obvious. I know this is very dull, and you're like, where is he going with this? Stick with me for a second, right? Let's say, right, like I said, I hit your arm, I grab your arm, I squeeze your arm, I do something that inflicts physical pain to your arm, right? That is a subjective experience that you feel, right? Your arm is in pain. Regardless of in my head, regardless of what my rationale for hitting your arm was, regardless of whether I think it's appropriate, regardless of whether I think it's okay or it's justified, regardless of what my upbringing was like and what my childhood was like and what my household experiences were and what my parents did, regardless of all of those things, you still feel pain, right? Your pain isn't diminished because I think it's okay, or because I dealt with a physically abusive household. Regardless of all of those different factors and scenarios, none of that changes the ultimate outcome that your arm is in pain, right? You are feeling pain, right? What we've done there is we've separated what my experience is from your experience, right? That is your subjective reality, something that you're dealing with that it shouldn't be influenced or factored or doesn't diminish based on what my experience or what my intent was by hitting your arm. And you can see from that example, what happens a lot of times with these codependent relationships is what one person, traditionally the person who is in that passive, that less demanding, less dominating role, traditionally what happens is their experience and their perception of what is happening to them is filtered based on what they think the other person intended to do, or based on maybe them believing that it's okay for the other person to treat them in that kind of way. And in essence, they're not independently feeling their own experience. They're not independently saying, hey, this is my body, right? This is my arm. These are my boundaries. These are things that I think are and are not okay. They're not sort of taking that path towards independence. What they are doing is they're filtering all of the things that are happening to them and filtering their experience based on that other individual, right? Based on the person who gets to set the roles and the guidelines, again, of that game. Now, even outside of just the confines and the context of individual relationships, a lot of us have codependency tendencies and behaviors at a sort of societal level, right? Outside of just relationships, looking at just our environment, our neighborhood, our outer experience outside of just relationships, right? Let's say that I am, again, outside of relationships here, let's say that I am a car thief, right? Let's say I steal cars for whatever reason. That's what I've decided to do. Whether I steal cars just for the cheap thrill and I like the adventure, I like the thrill of it, I like the high-speed chase, I like doing something that's criminal and I could get caught and I have to flee from authority, whether I'm doing it for that purpose or I'm stealing cars in order to sell them to the neighborhood crime lord so that I can pay for my daughter's heart transplant, right? Regardless of whether I'm doing it for a more sinister, in my mind, a more sinister reason, or doing it because I think it's good, because I think it's positive, because I think it's the right thing to do, it doesn't change the outcome that at the end of the day, the people I steal cars from, their experience doesn't change based on my rationale and based on my intentions, based on my expectations, right? At the end of the day, they still don't have a car, right? They still have to navigate their life without access to a car. They now have to get a new car. They have to go through the financial burden of handling that, and they have to go through maybe multiple days without means of transporting themselves to and from their different destinations, right? In other words, their subjective experience, it doesn't get enhanced or diminished based on my desire to steal their car, based on my rationale or intentions behind stealing their car, right? If you think, I remember having a conversation with someone about this, and they said, well, we're talking about the topic of cars being broken into, and it was around a time where there was a lot of like crime and a lot of people's cars were being broken into, and backpacks stolen, laptops, things like that. And I remember a person said to me, if someone breaks into your car, what was the exact line? It was something along the lines of, if someone breaks into your car and steals something, chances are they needed it more than you do. And I remember just listening and thinking, well, that sounds like a garbage logic that sounds ridiculous to me to say, okay, if someone is committing a crime and breaking into my vehicle, right, smashing my window, they take my laptop or they take my bag or they take belongings from my car, to say that they were going with the mindset of they needed it more than I do and it is justified and I should kind of give them a pass, because if they had the audacity to break into a car, chances are they were in a more dire situation than I was. And I just kind of thought about it and I was like, that's a ridiculous mindset to have, regardless of that person's individual experience, regardless of their financial need or what limited resources they have, or regardless of what dire situation that they're in, it doesn't then entitle them to be able to break my boundaries, right? It doesn't entitle them to be able to destroy and take things from me just because of their negative experience, right? That's a very codependent way of looking at the world and looking at interactions between human beings, right? What does their need and their desperation have to do with my right to not have my car broken into, right? Their desperation doesn't ultimately have to mean my victimization, right? And totally get it. I may have compassion for this person and they're going through a tough time and they're struggling financially, but my compassion, there's still a boundary there, right? There's still compassion with boundaries. It doesn't mean that because they are going through something turbulent, they're in a bad situation, again, bringing it back to relationships, whether it means that your partner is dealing with something or they dealt with something growing up, or their parents and their parental figures had a certain way of raising them and a certain way of disciplining their behavior. All of those things may be true. You may have compassion for your partner. You may sort of feel bad that they were in that predicament, but there has to be a boundary there where it doesn't then translate into you need to feel victimized, you need to now feel pain because of their, again, subjective experience, right? We need to keep those two things separate, right? You are one person, they are them, right? They are someone else. There needs to be a boundary whereby their pain and their subjective experience does not then need to bleed over into your life and what you're now experiencing. So in parting, right, as a mindset for breaking that pattern of codependency and working and striving and struggling and fighting towards independency, I don't know if that's a word, but have this sort of program running through your head, right? Regardless of what situation your partner, your friend, your family member, regardless of what situation they are in, regardless of what situation they used to be in, regardless of what situation and circumstances they grew up in or were raised in or were educated in, right? It doesn't mean that their unhealthy habits and their tendencies need to bleed over into your life and create pain and suffering for you, right? That is a hard boundary that you need to establish in order to have that independence, right? You can have a relationship, you can have a friendship, but at the end of the day, you are two independent beings deciding to be in a partnership, deciding to be in a relationship. That doesn't mean that your independence and that your sovereignty needs to be destroyed, right? Needs to be corrupted, needs to be tainted by them and their unhealthy experience, right? So make sure you keep that at the forefront of your mind, men and women, ladies and gents, as you're navigating your life, as you're navigating, regardless of what it is, like I said, friendships, relationships, business partnerships. Always keep that in mind, that your subjective experience is yours and yours only. You get to determine the quality of that experience, right? That is what it means to be a human being, to be an individual. So hope that you folks got some good nuggets, some good mindset from this video. If you did enjoy the video, click that like button, give us a thumbs up, leave a comment, share your thoughts, share opinions, stories, feedback, whatever you feel comfortable sharing. We'd love to hear from you. And make sure you subscribe to the channel. That way you'll be the first to know when we come out with new content. I've been getting some good feedback from people when they subscribe, right? When you subscribe to the channel, as you're searching and scrolling through the videos, my face will pop up on your computer, on your tablet, on your phone, and you'll see me with my silly thumbnail like this, doing one of these, and it'll bring some smile to your face, and you'll be like, man, I know that gentleman there is about to help me with my life, dating, and my dating life. So thanks for tuning in. As always, signing off and signing out. Catch you next time. Peace.